History is filled with wars, fallen empires, and revolutions that reshaped the world. But every so often, there are chapters so dark that they feel almost unreal. Stories that seem less like history and more like a nightmare humanity wishes it could forget. One of those stories begins in the final years of a crumbling empire, when millions of people suddenly found themselves marked for disappearance. Imagine waking up one day and discovering that the government of the land where your ancestors had lived for centuries had decided you should no longer exist. Your language, your culture, your faith, your families, even the villages where generations were born and buried. Everything suddenly declared a threat. This was the terrifying reality faced by the Armenian people during the final years of the Ottoman Empire. A civilization that had survived for more than 2,000 years suddenly became the target of one of the first systematic extermination campaigns of the modern era. The Armenian Genocide did not begin with gunfire or mass graves. Like many of the darkest crimes in history, it began quietly, hidden behind political language, fear, and suspicion. To understand how an entire population could be targeted for destruction, we must first travel back to the late 19th century, when the once mighty Ottoman Empire was slowly collapsing. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been one of the most powerful political forces in the world. At its height, it stretched across Southeast Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Istanbul, the imperial capital, was a crossroads of cultures, religions, and languages. Within this vast empire lived many ethnic and religious communities. Among them were the Armenians, an ancient Christian people whose roots in the region stretched back thousands of years, long before the Ottoman Turks arrived. Armenians were known as skilled merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and farmers. Their churches, monasteries, and schools dotted the mountainous landscapes of eastern Anatolia. Entire towns were built around Armenian communities that had existed since the time of the Roman Empire. Yet within the Ottoman system, Armenians occupied a complicated and fragile position. They were allowed to practice their religion and maintain their cultural identity, but they were also considered second-class subjects under Islamic law. They paid extra taxes. They had fewer legal protections. Their security depended largely on the tolerance of local authorities. For centuries, this uneasy balance held together. Armenians survived within the empire, navigating the political landscape while maintaining their identity. But as the 19th century drew to a close, the empire began to fracture under enormous pressure. Nationalist movements were spreading across Europe and the Balkans. Several Christian populations under Ottoman rule were rebelling and gaining independence. To the leaders in Istanbul, these rebellions were terrifying warnings. The empire was shrinking. Territories were slipping away. And suspicion began to grow toward other Christian minorities who still remained within Ottoman borders. Among them, the Armenians. What had once been seen as a loyal community slowly became viewed as a potential threat. Rumors spread that Armenians were secretly collaborating with foreign powers, particularly Russia, the Ottoman Empire's longtime rival. Fear turned into paranoia. Paranoia slowly turned into policy. And by the early 20th century, a radical new leadership had come to power within the Ottoman government. A group known as the Young Turks, who believed that the empire could only survive by transforming into a unified Turkish nation. For them, diversity was no longer a strength. It was a danger. And in their eyes, the Armenians had become an obstacle to the future they envisioned. What followed would soon evolve into one of the most horrifying campaigns of destruction the modern world had ever witnessed. But before the mass deportations began, before the deserts filled with death marches, something even more chilling happened first. The intellectuals were targeted. The leaders disappeared. And in one single night in April of 1915, the fate of an entire people began to change forever. In the early hours of April 24, 1915, something strange began unfolding across the great imperial city of Constantinople. The streets were quiet, the Bosphorus waters dark and still, and most of the population slept unaware that history was about to shift in a terrifying direction. Orders had already been issued in secret. Lists had already been prepared. And soldiers were already moving through the city. Before sunrise, Ottoman authorities began knocking on doors across Armenian neighborhoods. But they were not arresting random citizens. They were looking for very specific people: writers, doctors, teachers, lawyers, priests, journalists, community leaders, anyone capable of speaking for the Armenian people. One by one, hundreds of Armenian intellectuals were taken from their homes. Many were told they were simply being questioned by authorities. Some were allowed to bring coats. Others were rushed away without explanation, while their families stood frozen in confusion. Within hours, more than 200 Armenian leaders had disappeared into Ottoman custody. Most of them would never return. This moment, now remembered as Red Sunday, marked the beginning of the Armenian Genocide. The strategy was chillingly calculated. By removing the intellectual and cultural leadership of the Armenian community, the Ottoman government ensured that millions of ordinary people would soon be left without voices, organization, or protection. Without leaders, resistance becomes nearly impossible. But the arrests in Constantinople were only the first step. Across the vast eastern provinces of the empire, similar events were unfolding in towns and villages where Armenians had lived for centuries. Ottoman officials began issuing new orders under the justification of wartime security. The First World War had erupted the year before, and the Ottoman Empire had joined the conflict on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The empire now faced Russian forces along its eastern frontier, a region where large Armenian populations also lived. Ottoman leaders began spreading a dangerous narrative. They claimed Armenians were secretly supporting the Russian enemy. They claimed Armenian civilians were planning rebellions inside Ottoman territory. These accusations were repeated in government announcements, newspapers, and military reports. Fear was being manufactured. And it was working. Soon, Armenian men across eastern Anatolia began receiving official orders to report for military service. At first, this seemed normal. Many Armenians had already served in the Ottoman army for generations. But this time something was different. Once gathered into military labor battalions, thousands of Armenian soldiers were disarmed. Their weapons were taken away, and they were assigned to road construction and other heavy labor. Then, quietly and systematically, they began to disappear. In remote areas far from witnesses, Armenian soldiers were executed in small groups. Sometimes they were shot. Sometimes they were killed with axes or bayonets. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves or left in ravines where no one would find them. The empire had effectively eliminated most Armenian men capable of defending their communities. Back in the towns and villages, the next phase of the plan was already beginning. Ottoman officials announced that Armenian populations would be relocated for their own safety away from the war zone. Families were told they needed to prepare for deportation to the Syrian desert regions under Ottoman control. They were given very little time. Sometimes only a few hours. They could carry only what they were able to hold in their hands. Homes that had stood for generations were abandoned overnight. Churches were locked. Schools emptied. Shops closed forever. But the most terrifying part of the order was this. Entire villages were forced onto the roads. Women, children, the elderly, all of them marched away under armed guard toward destinations that few of them would ever reach. At first, many Armenians believed this truly was a temporary relocation. They believed the empire would eventually allow them to return home. But as the endless lines of deportees began moving deeper into the Anatolian wilderness, a horrifying realization slowly began to spread among them. This was not relocation. It was something far darker. Because the roads they were walking were not leading to new homes. They were leading into one of the most brutal death marches in human history. And the desert waiting ahead would soon become a graveyard for hundreds of thousands. At first the columns of deportees moved slowly through the hills of Anatolia, stretching across dusty roads like endless shadows under the burning sun. Soldiers on horseback surrounded them, rifles slung across their shoulders, watching silently as families shuffled forward with whatever possessions they had managed to carry from their homes. Some held blankets. Some clutched family Bibles. Others carried children too young to understand why their world had suddenly disappeared. There were no wagons for most of them. No organized supplies. No clear destination that anyone could explain. Only the order to keep moving. What began as a forced relocation quickly transformed into something far more sinister. Food ran out within days. Wells along the roads were often guarded or deliberately poisoned. Anyone who fell behind risked being beaten, robbed, or simply abandoned by the guards. The weak began collapsing first. Elderly grandparents who had spent their lives tending vineyards or orchards suddenly found themselves walking across endless plains under scorching heat. Many could not last more than a few days. When they fell, the columns did not stop. Families faced an impossible decision. Stay with their loved ones and risk execution for delaying the march, or leave them behind on the roadside. Many parents carried children until their arms could no longer move. Some mothers wrapped their babies in cloth and begged strangers further along the column to take them. But even the strongest could not escape what was waiting further down the road. Bands of irregular militias often appeared along the route. Some were Kurdish tribesmen recruited by Ottoman officials. Others were criminals released from prisons and given weapons in exchange for participating in the deportations. They descended upon the convoys like predators. Clothing was stripped from deportees. Jewelry was ripped from ears and necks. Women were abducted. Children were taken. Entire groups vanished into the surrounding hills. Those who survived these attacks were forced to continue marching. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The landscape itself began to change as the columns moved southward. The fertile highlands of eastern Anatolia slowly faded behind them, replaced by barren valleys and endless stretches of dust. The closer they came to the Syrian desert, the fewer survivors remained. Starvation spread through the deportation lines. People began chewing grass, leaves, and even leather from their own shoes. Water became so scarce that some families drank from muddy puddles shared with animals. Disease followed quickly behind hunger. Typhus, dysentery, cholera. Bodies began appearing along the roadside so frequently that travelers could no longer avoid stepping around them. Some survivors later described the roads as lined with skeletons. Others spoke of vultures circling above the columns, waiting patiently for the marchers to fall. But the true horror awaited those who reached the final destination. The Syrian desert. One of the most feared locations was the region surrounding Deir-ez-Zor, an isolated desert zone far from the major cities of the empire. Ottoman authorities had chosen this area precisely because it was so unforgiving. The desert offered no shelter, no reliable water, no farms, no infrastructure capable of supporting the massive numbers of deportees being forced into it. When Armenian survivors arrived after months of marching, they were placed into makeshift camps scattered across the desert landscape. But these camps were not designed to sustain life. They were designed for something else entirely. Food shipments rarely arrived. Medical care was non-existent. Guards prevented most escape attempts. And new columns of deportees continued arriving week after week, each group more exhausted than the last. The camps quickly became places of mass death. Children died first. Then the elderly. Soon even the strongest adults began collapsing under starvation and disease. Witnesses later described entire families lying together on the sand, too weak to stand. Some survivors wandered into the desert hoping to find water and never returned. Others simply lay down beside the bodies of loved ones and waited for the end. By the time the death marches slowed in 1916, vast regions of the Syrian desert had become silent burial grounds. Hundreds of thousands had vanished into the sands. Yet what makes this tragedy even more haunting is that the world outside the Ottoman Empire was not entirely unaware of what was happening. Diplomats, missionaries, journalists. They were watching. And they were sending reports describing horrors that many people in Europe and America struggled to believe. Because the scale of what was unfolding seemed almost unimaginable. But the evidence was there. And the truth was slowly reaching the outside world. While the endless columns of Armenian deportees were disappearing into the deserts of the Ottoman Empire, the outside world was slowly beginning to hear whispers of what was happening. At first the reports seemed unbelievable. The idea that an entire population was being deliberately erased by its own government sounded too extreme, too brutal to be true. Yet the evidence kept arriving. Foreign diplomats stationed throughout the Ottoman Empire began sending urgent telegrams to their governments. Missionaries working in Armenian towns wrote desperate letters describing the emptying of entire cities. Travelers who passed along the deportation routes spoke of roads lined with starving families and scattered bodies. Among the most important witnesses was Henry Morgenthau, the United States ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. From his office in Constantinople he received countless reports from American consuls and missionaries who were witnessing the deportations firsthand. Town after town was being emptied of Armenians. Villages that had existed for centuries were suddenly silent. Entire populations were vanishing into the interior of the empire. Morgenthau quickly realized that these events were not isolated tragedies caused by wartime chaos. They were part of a coordinated government policy. Ottoman officials were not trying to protect Armenian civilians from the war. They were systematically removing them from the empire. And they knew that the vast majority would not survive the journey. In his communications to Washington, Morgenthau described what he believed was unfolding as a campaign to annihilate an entire race. He tried repeatedly to pressure Ottoman leaders to stop the deportations. But each time he confronted them, they denied responsibility or claimed the relocations were necessary for national security. Privately, however, some Ottoman officials were far more honest. Several admitted that the empire had decided the Armenian population was too dangerous to remain. In their view, the only way to guarantee the survival of the Ottoman state was to remove Armenians permanently. Morgenthau later wrote that the Ottoman leaders did not seem ashamed of their plan. In fact, some spoke about it with disturbing confidence, as if they were simply solving a political problem. Meanwhile, American missionaries scattered throughout Anatolia and Syria continued documenting what they saw. They described starving children wandering through abandoned streets after deportation convoys had passed. They described orphanages overflowing with Armenian survivors rescued from the marches. They described entire regions where Armenian churches had been looted or burned. Perhaps most haunting were the reports from the Syrian desert. Witnesses who traveled near Deir-ez-Zor described landscapes filled with camps where thousands of Armenians were dying slowly under the sun. Some wrote that the desert itself had become a massive open-air graveyard. News of these events eventually reached Europe and the United States through newspapers and humanitarian organizations. By 1915, international headlines were already describing the destruction of the Armenian people. The governments of France, Britain, and Russia issued a joint declaration condemning what they called crimes against humanity and civilization. It was one of the first times in history that such language had been used to describe the actions of a government against its own population. Relief organizations began raising money to help Armenian survivors. American charities alone collected millions of dollars to provide food, shelter, and care for refugees scattered across the Middle East. But despite growing awareness, there was little the world could do to stop the catastrophe as it was happening. The First World War was raging across continents. Nations were consumed by their own battles, their own survival. And within the collapsing Ottoman Empire, the deportations continued. By the time the war finally ended in 1918, the Armenian population of Anatolia had been almost completely erased. Historians estimate that around 1.5 million Armenians died during the genocide through starvation, disease, massacres, and death marches. Ancient communities that had existed for millennia were gone. Cities that once echoed with Armenian language and culture had fallen silent. Yet even after the empire collapsed, another tragedy would begin to unfold. Because the crime that destroyed the Armenians would soon enter a new and disturbing chapter. Denial. And the struggle for recognition would continue for more than a century. When the First World War finally came to an end in 1918, the Ottoman Empire collapsed along with it. The vast empire that had ruled over large parts of the Middle East and southeastern Europe for centuries was suddenly gone, leaving behind shattered governments, ruined cities, and millions of displaced people. Among those survivors were the scattered remnants of the Armenian population. Those who had somehow survived the death marches, the starvation, the disease, and the massacres were now spread across refugee camps throughout Syria, Lebanon, and other parts of the Middle East. Entire families had disappeared. Children wandered alone through crowded camps with no idea whether their parents were still alive. Communities that had once filled towns and villages across eastern Anatolia now existed only in memory. For many Armenians, survival meant exile. With their homes destroyed and their ancestral lands emptied, hundreds of thousands began migrating to new countries across the world. Armenian communities slowly formed in places like France, the United States, Russia, Lebanon, and many other regions. These communities carried with them stories that were almost impossible to comprehend. Stories of endless desert marches. Stories of children lost along the road. Stories of towns that vanished in a matter of weeks. For the survivors, remembering became both a burden and a responsibility. They knew that if the world forgot what had happened, the voices of those who died would vanish forever. But the aftermath of the genocide brought another painful reality: denial. In the years following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, a new Turkish state emerged from the ruins. Its leaders were focused on rebuilding a modern nation from the chaos of war and occupation. Within this new political climate, acknowledging the destruction of the Armenian population became a deeply controversial issue. Many officials rejected the idea that the events of 1915 constituted a deliberate genocide. Instead, they argued that the deaths occurred as part of the broader chaos of war, famine, and civil conflict that affected many communities during that period. This dispute over interpretation would grow into one of the longest and most intense historical debates of the modern era. For Armenians around the world, the events were not a matter of interpretation. They were lived experiences passed down through generations. Grandparents told grandchildren about the roads through the desert. Family photographs became precious fragments of a vanished homeland. Churches, schools, and cultural institutions across the Armenian diaspora preserve these memories, ensuring that the story of the genocide would not disappear. Over time, historians began examining thousands of documents from diplomatic archives, military reports, missionary records, and survivor testimonies. The overwhelming majority of scholars eventually concluded that the deportations and mass killings of Armenians were not accidental wartime tragedies. They were part of a deliberate campaign carried out by Ottoman authorities. During the late 20th and early 21st centuries, more and more countries began officially recognizing the Armenian genocide. Parliaments across Europe, the Americas, and other parts of the world issued formal statements acknowledging the events as one of the first modern genocides. For many Armenians, these recognitions represented small steps toward historical justice. But the deeper wound remains. Because the genocide did not only destroy lives. It erased entire landscapes of culture. Ancient monasteries, villages, and communities that had existed for centuries across Anatolia disappeared almost overnight. Today, the Armenian genocide stands as one of the darkest warnings in human history. It reminds us how quickly fear, nationalism, and political power can transform neighbors into enemies. It shows how propaganda can turn suspicion into violence, and violence into systematic destruction. Perhaps most importantly, it forces us to confront a terrifying truth. Genocide does not begin with weapons. It begins with the belief that some people do not belong. And once that belief takes hold, the road toward unimaginable tragedy can begin quietly, almost invisibly, until it is far too late to stop. More than a century has passed since the Armenian genocide. Yet its echoes continue to shape politics, memory, and identity across the world. Not only as a story of unimaginable suffering, but as a reminder of the responsibility every generation carries to recognize the past, protect the vulnerable, and ensure that such darkness never rises again.